Hi there. My name is Surya, and I'm a part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing our program and speakers. We'll be discussing Alex von Tunzelmann's timely and lively new book, Fallen Idols, which examines 12 controversial statues from around the world and the stories those statues tell about our communities, nations, and global social movements. It's a fascinating read, and I can't wait for you to learn more about it in just a bit. Alex is the author of Blood and Sand, Indian Summer, and Red Heat. Her writing can be found in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. Joining Alex in discussion today is Dr. Paul Farber, director and co-founder of the Monument Lab, an organization based in Philadelphia dedicated to reimagining how our monuments are made, preserved, and interpreted. The Monument Lab actually just came out with their national monument audit, which assesses the current monument landscape across the United States. The findings in the audit are totally fascinating, so I encourage you to check it out, along with Fallen Idols, of course. You can borrow Fallen Idols for free with your NYPL library card, or if you don't have a card just yet and you live in New York State, I encourage you to apply for one so that way you can check out the book. We're also selling the book online through the library's shop. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. We'll be sharing the links to get the book in the chat. Those links can also be found on the event page at nypl.org/live. We have so many exciting programs coming up at Live from NYPL. Next Thursday, we'll be presenting a conversation on the future of New York City after the mayoral election. Further out in November, we have a discussion with Louis Nelson, designer of the mural wall at the Korean War Veterans Memorial. He'll be speaking about his memoir with William Kelly, NYPL's Andrew W. Mellon, Director of Research Libraries. We also have a talk with Merve Emre about her annotated new version of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And that's just a small sample of the many amazing programs that we have coming up. So we hope that you'll tune in again. These programs are made possible thanks to the generosity of folks like you. So please consider supporting the library however you can. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to share. Firstly, the library values your privacy. So in the spirit of transparency, there are a couple of things that we'd like for you to know. Even though the video and chat are hosted on an nypl.org page, they are hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might be sharing data about yourself, which the library does not control. For more details, you can visit our FAQ page, along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, which can all be found on the event page. Alex would be glad to answer your questions about the book. You can send them at any time using the chat, Google form, or by emailing us at publicprograms@nypl.org. Alex will get to as many questions as she can as time allows at the end of the program. Real-time captions are available for tonight's program. You can click on the closed caption button or use the stream text link shared in the reminder email and chat for a live transcript. Okay, now without further ado, I'd love to welcome our speakers, Alex von Tunzelmann and Paul Farber, to our virtual stage.
Well, hello. This is such a treat to be here with you.
Such a treat to be here with you, Paul. Thank you so much. And thank you to the NYPL for setting this up.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, thank you to the New York Public Library. And for those folks who are joining us, wherever you may be, I want to hold up the hard copy, the old-fashioned screen share of Alex's new book, Fallen Idols, 12 statues that made history, and will be the subject of our conversation. And I'm so excited for us to hop in. So I want to start off, you know, just kind of note that, of course, this is a book about generations of history, and of course, about the last several years of reckoning and reimagining. When did you decide that you wanted to write this book?
Well, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. I first wrote about statue controversies when, back in 2016, there was a controversy over the Cecil Rhodes statue at Oxford University in the UK, and I wrote a piece about that, started thinking about it. But really, kind of this book was kicked off very soon after the killing of George Floyd in the United States, and then, of course, the Black Lives Matter protests that followed that. And a thing that happened in the UK, where I live, was this extraordinary moment in the city of Bristol, where a statue of Edward Colston, who was someone who was very, very strongly associated with the history of Bristol, who's known as a great philanthropist, but was also extremely significant in the slave trade. And that statue has been controversial for a very long time, like about 100 years. And a group of people simply came and pulled that statue down and had this very dramatic protest where they threw it into Bristol Harbour. Pictures all over the world, this extraordinary reaction on social media and so on, and then a huge backlash from the government and so on against this. And at the same time, of course, this was happening in the US, it was happening everywhere in the world, that suddenly statues of slave traders, colonialists, all these kind of Confederates in the US notably, were all being pulled down in response to these protests. And I thought, this is something really interesting that's happening. This is, you know, an iconoclasm, which literally means the breaking of idols. You know, this is something that has happened quite a lot before in history. It's happened, you know, smashing of statues has happened in the French Revolution, for instance, the fall of communism, you know, but not on this global scale that we saw in 2020. And I thought, well, I think historically we need to have a conversation about this. We need to inform it. And also it really struck me that at that time, a lot of the conversation, certainly in the US and in the UK, and, you know, also in a number of other places, was, you know, very kind of politicized, partisan, very limited, and wasn't really considering the kind of broader historical contexts about, you know, monuments and meanings and the ways we discuss history. So I wanted to really open that up and broaden it out.
Yeah. You know, I think you have a chapter about the Edward Colston statue and this incredibly important moment of protesters not only toppling the statue, but throwing it into the waters as a reference to the legacies of violence and harm done by Colston as a person who was an enslaver. And you mentioned that the statue had been controversial. I'm just curious to hear from you, what makes a statue controversial, and kind of who, from your point of view and your research, designates the kind of sense of which statues are under the spotlight and for what reasons?
Well, this, you know, something that I really noticed is this changes a lot throughout history and depending on the perspective and the place and everything else. So, I mean, in terms of Colston's statue, it's kind of an interesting case study because his period when he lived was really sort of the 17th to early 18th century. So, you know, around from the kind of, he was living in the, sort of the 1600s, basically, a long time ago, through what we had in England, the English Civil War. You know, that was when he was kind of growing up. And then he became kind of effectively the CEO of the Royal African Company, which was then the, you know, the British kind of, the English at that time, governments, the king's kind of official slave trading company. It had a monopoly at that time, so it was the only one initially. That changed later on. So he was an incredibly significant figure in that. But what happened is that history then keeps moving on. So he was known as this very significant figure at that time. He left an awful lot of money. He didn't have any children, so he left a lot of his money to charitable interests in Bristol and so on. So that's why loads of schools named after him, loads of public places, you know, his name very well known. There was even Colston Day that was celebrated. But what happened was that after his death, you know, the slave trade became something that, you know, really politically 100 years after that was very, very difficult. So it was banned in Britain in the early 19th century. It was something that had really politically moved from being so acceptable that the king was doing it all the way through to being completely unacceptable and banned. And at that time, when they started to kind of talk about Colston in Bristol, that's when they really started erasing that history. They started not talking about his involvement in the slave trade at that point. The statue went up even longer after that. It went up right at the end of the 19th century, so in the 1890s. So that's, you know, kind of 170 something years after he died, a long, long time. So it wasn't of a piece with his history, it was much later. And when they put the statue up, because by then Britain saw itself as like a crusading anti-slavery nation, that's when really that statue had to erase his history of involvement in the slave trade. So it referenced his ocean-going trade on the statue, and it did that with this kind of allegorical figure of some mermen and dolphins and things, you know, not remotely being honest about what was the actual reason that he had made all this money. And really, it was put up in the late 19th century because Bristolians were terribly worried at that point. The kind of, you know, a sort of merchant class was very worried about socialism. So what they were trying to do is present this paternalistic image of beneficent capitalism that was kind of, you know, somehow really that was the way that workers should uplift themselves, was through this, not through these kind of new ideas about socialism that become very threatening. So that statue was a very political statement, but not for something that really had anything to do with Edward Colston. So, you know, it went through lots of phases. So when it became controversial was kind of almost immediately, because obviously lots of people in Bristol didn't take this point of view. And then, you know, as I say, it went up in the 1890s. Around 30 years after that, there came out quite a critical biography of Colston that started to talk about his slave trading again. Actually, that didn't come from left-wingers at that time. It came from the Christian community who felt very against slaveholding. It was actually written by a reverend. And then that's when people really started to kind of think, oh, maybe this Colston stuff is actually a little embarrassing now. Maybe it's a bit of the past. But it took another 100 years from that to get to the point when the statue was taken down. And during that time, I think, you know, as obviously so much change in the 20th century, of course, in the US, you have this incredible civil rights movement and everything. And in Britain, that also informed our conversations about civil rights, about race, about the history of slavery and all of that. So, you know, by the kind of 1990s, 2000s, this statue was considered extremely offensive by a lot of people in Bristol already. And it has taken such a long time to move from there to action.
I mean, that context is so important. I think one of the things I found so fascinating about your book is giving us as readers a sense of when monuments are dedicated. And I want to get to your four kind of rules about, or maybe four points of debunk about the monument mind. But I want to just bring up something first, which is really about this idea that monuments, at least in your accounts, and I think this probably could extend beyond, are often not dedicated in a moment of someone's historical impact. And these are figures that are deployed years later by power brokers to extend their own power or to lay claim in other ways. I'm just curious for you, what did you sense in writing this book about when statues are fundraised for and dedicated, and what that tells us about historical memory or mismemory?
Such an important question. It's a particularly important question, of course, in the US, because, I mean, Paul, as you will know, many of our listeners may well be aware, the vast bulk of Confederate statues, for instance, really went up in the early 20th century, kind of 1900 to 1920 was kind of the boom period for those, a long time after the end of the Confederacy, you know, and really when there were not, to be honest, many veterans still surviving. It was put up by, you know, these were groups of veterans' descendants that kind of got obsessed with this history, and clearly that had an awful lot to do with the political climate at the time. And that's what we see again and again repeated around the world, is that often these statues are indeed going up much later. They're not, you know, some record of the time that this happened. They're not a kind of monument in terms that kind of often more physical monuments are, that is, you know, for instance, the site of a battle or something like that. They're often something much, much later, which is really about making a political statement about current politics. And so, you know, with the Confederate statues, of course, when they were going up was, of course, a time when the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise again, when you had, you know, Jim Crow laws being enacted across the US. So it was in an environment where that was, again, a very deliberate political statement. The Confederacy was then being used to kind of underline this form of Southern identity, this kind of, you know, kind of the end of Reconstruction and really kind of, you know, a period of segregation. These were being used then as a very deliberate statement to support that.
And I found this point in Fallen Idols so helpful. It comes early in the book, but you bring us full circle that, you know, anytime as you write that there's a debate about a statue's status, watch out for these kind of 4 arguments that are going to pop up. Do you want to talk a bit about that for readers? Because I have to say, I found it so constructive because you carefully go through each, but you also let us know what I sense is disingenuousness of those lines of thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I found these sort of fascinating because they just kept cropping up everywhere. You know, one of the crucial things about the book is that I'm also looking at, for instance, the former Soviet Union and, you know, and India, the former British Empire, and all sorts of places like this, you know, which you would think culturally had extremely different contexts, and of course do. And these arguments still come up there too. So the 4 arguments identified, the first one is the erasure of history, the fear, the sort of anxiety that taking statues down will somehow, you know, destroy our memory of a certain historical person or event, that it will change these things. And of course, you know, from the point of view of historians, this is sort of extraordinary, since historical discussion is constantly about rewriting and changing and remembering in different ways. But there is a great deal, you will see this line about erasing history come up very, very often in these discussions. The second one I looked at was an argument I call the man of his time. It is usually a man, which is kind of, that is an argument that is about trying to justify things on the basis of the things were different back then. So this is a presumption. And again, this is a complete fallacy, really, that, you know, the idea that, for instance, if you look at Cecil Rhodes's statues, particularly in South Africa, Zimbabwe, the UK, places where those are, people will say, oh, well, you know, everybody was racist back then, which is kind of the most extraordinary statement, because first of all, who is included in everybody in this statement? I mean, quite clearly, everybody means upper class white men, if that's what the statement is, which is quite a problematic definition of everybody. But also it's not even true for them. I mean, in fact, the crucial thing about somebody like Cecil Rhodes is that he was not remotely a man of his time. He was extraordinary within his own time. And that's something that I think his critics and his fans would actually agree on, you know. So this idea that people are somehow of their time and, you know, you just senselessly formed by this environment is just not how people work. The third argument is about the importance of law and order. And this is a kind of, perhaps a more sort of sympathetic argument, which is a fear that mobs pulling down statues or groups of people kind of doing this without authorization is, you know, a very frightening thing, a worrying thing that will happen. But the interesting thing you see about this argument is that people often have very different opinions depending on which mob and which situation. So a lot of people who were very, very upset about this happening during Black Lives Matter say, you know, Western conservatives were often very upset about Black Lives Matter attacking monuments, were people who were absolutely cheering on the Ukrainians in 2015 when they were pulling down statues of Lenin in an absolutely similar situation, or were cheering on the end of the fall of communism across the USSR when, of course, lots of statues were pulled down at that time. So we can see that actually law and order argument is very contextual depending on which law and order you've decided that you support and whether you think that should be respected or not. And the fourth and final argument that I keep coming back to is the slippery slope. And this is an argument which is kind of, you know, well, where do we stop? Okay, so if we pull down, you know, a statue of, you know, Nathan Bedford Forrest, for instance, where do we stop next? Is it going to end up with George Washington being pulled down? Is it going to end up with Jefferson? Very recently has been pulled down again. You know, is it going to end up with us kind of, you know, destroying everything about history? And I mean, again, I think this is kind of an argument that's fairly obviously a kind of, in some senses, it's a fallacy in that actually you can't really take an argument that says, okay, so this reasonable thing that's happening, what if we change all the details of it and have an imaginary thing that's much less reasonable? Well, then of course it's unreasonable. But also that actually I'm quite open to having discussions about all these things. There should not be any historical figures that we cannot discuss and examine. I mean, these aren't, you know, when we're talking about political statues, these are not sacred people, these are not gods, and we must be able to discuss all of them quite openly. I mean, as a historian, I think that's intensely important. So all of these are kind of fallacies, and when you can really see their fallacies, the really easy way to prove it is to look at them, as I say, in the context of totalitarianism. So look at, for instance, World War II, Germany. After the war, Germany removed all Nazi statuary and sculpture by law, and that was done in both East and West Germany. That's all gone. And we see that history has not been erased. We see that there was no kind of moaning about, oh, but the Nazis were men of their time. No, that would be an intensely distasteful argument. We see that there's no, the idea that kind of there was this slippery slope that's caused disaster just wasn't borne out. So actually, we can see that statues can be removed without any of these problems. So the question isn't about removal of statues per se, it has to look at individual cases.
Yeah, and something I was just thinking about, those points I think are really helpful for people to ground themselves, to get away from a binary of like, will all the monuments stay up or will they all come down? Because if the option right now is to either look away from a generational problem and put your head in the sand, or not toppled during the last 2 years. So yeah. The large, major majority are still intact. And if you take a look at any sources of takedowns over the last several years, the majority were not toppled by people. That's not to say anything against that, actually. In fact, a lot of times you see, and you point this out in the book, when policy has failed, when policy has for a long time reinforced a status quo that's harmful, people do take that action. But in most cases, it's local governments figuring out case by case. And I was thinking about this idea, that like for anybody out there who wants to know the history of an event, history of something, what do you do to figure that out? You don't, you go to the New York Public Library or your local library, you search on YouTube or Netflix, you talk to your family or your teachers or your grandparents. You don't say, I have to go and find this monument. And so their monuments are part of the historical landscape, but they're not the only place that our history lives. And I think that you're pointing out these fallacies has been really helpful for people out there who want to see change. They want to also value history, and it's not a zero-sum game.
Absolutely. And I mean, I very, very much value history and heritage. I mean, it's the basis of most of my work. I intensely support it. But I think that you're absolutely right. It's a different, and we have to think about this first of all, history is obviously not embodied particularly in statues, although also monuments more generally. And that statistic you have, I mean, I must say, I rather wish you'd published this report before I'd written my book. You made my life a lot easier. All the fantastic research in it is so great. And I really recommend people have a look. National Monument Audit, there is a website for it. It's excellent and very, very easy to see all the conclusions. But yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is that stat you have about 99.4% staying. I mean, the vast majority of art and monuments throughout history get destroyed. That is what happens historically. This is usually
over a long enough time period.
Absolutely. Conservation is the exception. So this is something highly unusual. So that's quite impressive. And yeah, I think, it's also separating this idea that these things somehow embody history from, I mean, actually, history is in books and documentaries and museum collections and minds and archives and all sorts of things. And, it's not actually in these lumps of stone. I also think there probably are differences in terms of different types of monuments. And I know you guys have looked into this as well, but, something like a statue that often is, as we've said, put up, decades or centuries after the person lived is a very, very kind of specific thing that doesn't actually really tell you a story or anything whatsoever. Whereas other forms of monument that might be, say, a battlefield might actually have a lot more to them in terms of being educative. I think if you go to, some kind of national monuments in the US, like, Gettysburg or the Alamo or anything like this, you do then get a sense of the place and the feeling. That's quite different to me from a statue. That's a very different form of monument.
Yeah, but I was thinking of like, I love that future readers will read Fallen Idols and the National Monument Audit together. I was also thinking about a book I read recently, Forget the Alamo, that also points out some of the ways,
right,
especially in that site, that myth has perpetuated both, political challenges, but also the erasure of the stories of enslavement, for example, as central to the story of Texas. And I was thinking about the historian Michel Roth-Trouillot, who says the bigger the material mass, the more likely it is to entrap us. But thinking of mass, I want to talk, like, you have gathered such a layered, thoughtful history, and I want to just go into a few of the chapters that you have. I want to start with 1776, the takedown of the statue of George III on Bowling Green in Lower Manhattan, and something just to call out and then just hear your thoughts on it. This idea that some of that statue ended up being melted down into Revolutionary War bullets. And just to hear how you encountered that story and what are some of the important takeaways for readers of the book.
Yeah, well, so this statue, and I mean, of course, I'm sure a lot of people listening will know this story, and I was telling it quite deliberately, provocatively, because, you know, the idea that pulling down statues, which was said a lot in 2020, was somehow un-American. I was like, well, actually, the foundation event of America was George Washington reading out Declaration of Independence, and then he didn't lead it himself, but, you know, a number of his soldiers, sailors and so on serving under him, also a load of civilians, some of the Sons of Liberty, various people went to Bowling Green and pulled down this massive equestrian statue, so a statue of a man on a horse of George III, the British king at that time, technically the American king, not for long. But he, you know, this statue was, yes, so it was made of lead. Now, this was quite usual at the time, but lead soon became quite an unpopular material for statues because it turns out that not only is it incredibly heavy, but it actually kind of melts over time. So the statue starts to kind of really look very unattractive after a few years. It sort of slumps back into the ground. But at the time, it was very common to make it of lead because it could be cast. So it's quite a cheap statue as well. Also quite crucial. This was not a particularly expensive or well thought out monument. But of course, lead was very valuable, especially to the revolutionaries. So indeed it was, the statue was chopped into pieces and it was shipped away to be melted down into lead and turned into bullets to be used against the British in the war. Now, we know from the number of bullets, and some people have done some math with the bullets and the amount of lead in the statue, that quite a lot of lead did not make it to the bullets. And we know where some of that has gone. So for instance, I think the New York Historical Society has the tail of the horse and a bit of an arm, I think. And somebody found an arm in their garden a few years ago and sold it for a tremendous amount of money at auction. So check your gardens. You know, bits of it obviously were taken as souvenirs. The head was apparently carried back to the UK. But, you know, bits of it went, but most of it was melted down to bullets. And I think this is a sort of fascinating story because not only is that, of course, so evocative, but actually this is something that has happened a few times. So also in the French Revolution, there were stories of statues being melted down to make cannon and guillotines and all of this kind of stuff. And then there were stories of, in other revolutions, of cannon being melted down to make statues. So sometimes these go through several different iterations. But absolutely, I mean, in the US, that was obviously a highly symbolic moment. And I have no doubt that some of it really did end up in bullets. Whether they were used or not, I don't know. But I'm sure that did happen.
Just another story from the book. Thank you for that. Another story from the book that's more recent is, of course, the taking down of the statue to Saddam Hussein. As you write, of course, it was the onset of the Iraq War, but in large part, you called it and you referred to many people noting it as Iraq's Berlin Wall moment, as if that was a culmination or as we know, this kind of misguided phrase, the so-called end of history. You know, I think it's really important, the work that you did in talking about the dynamics of that takedown, of how it related to, of course, not just a media moment, but a misreading and profound violence and harm that's perpetuated against Iraqi people for years to come. And just to kind of walk us through how that chapter got in the book and what you felt was important to share in this chapter on Saddam Hussein's statue being pulled down.
So the Saddam statue story is one of the weirdest stories. And it's such a complex one. And so, you know, I'll try and do the potted version of it, but it's super weird. And so I would encourage people just read it, see what you think. Mm-hmm. But it's, because that statue, when that came down, many of us who are, I'm afraid, old enough to remember will probably remember that on TV we were showing these extraordinary images of this enormous statue of Saddam being pulled over onto the front. You know, little crowd of Iraqis cheering about this. And it was very much presented, this, as a kind of release, as a conclusion of like, oh, that's done, he's fallen, you know, this has happened. And it was actually, that clip was rerun. I have the exact stats in the book, but like roughly every 4 minutes for that 24 hours on Fox News, and even roughly every 7 on CNN. So it was being run, it was really being heavily sold to the public as this was this climactic moment that really, you know, the war had kind of reached this point and Saddam was falling, Saddam had fallen. Now, of course, he hadn't. I mean, for months afterwards, he would still not be found. So this was actually not really what had happened, but also in terms of what was happening with the statue, that was an event that had been really kind of sort of, I mean, it had been staged, but it had been staged in a quite an interesting, spontaneous way. So during that invasion of Iraq at that time, British and American troops actually were pulling down statues all the time. So there were thousands of Saddam statues in Iraq. He was a big statue putter upper. And we should also talk about the regimes that put lots and lots of statues up, because they often are also quite troubling. But Saddam put up thousands of statues for himself. We don't have an exact number. And what the British and American troops and the other invading troops were doing was actually pulling them down everywhere that they were. And that was happening literally on a daily basis. There were so many that they just kept pulling them down. And these, you know, but most of these were not providing particularly great footage. And so this one in Baghdad, this big one in Firdaus Square, which means Paradise Square in Baghdad, what happened is that this was right opposite the big hotel where all the journalists were staying. And there was a small group of Iraqis. There's one guy who says he turned up with a sledgehammer wanting to pull this thing down, right? But the exciting thing about this potentially was that it appeared like Iraqis were maybe trying to pull it down, not American and British troops who were blowing this stuff up every day. So suddenly there was a lot of, you know, sort of cameras turning round to see this guy with his sledgehammer kind of trying to get this statue down. But it was a massive, great thing. And he was one guy and he really couldn't get very far. He just managed to get a bit of a plaque off the base of it. And it was then that American troops really decided to get involved. Now they did radio up for authorization, but they were not directed by the Pentagon. They did do it off their own bat, as far as we can see. So they used a military vehicle to help the Iraqis pull this statue down. And it's very clear that the statue would not have come down without American involvement at that stage. They were not having any success. But partly the Americans were very worried about there then being footage of Iraqis failing to pull a statue down, that would not be a Berlin Wall moment. That would be, you know, really kind of anticlimactic. So they had to help them. Then, of course, you had this kind of very controversial situation where one American soldier climbed up and flew an American flag from the top of the statue, and very, very quickly, radio coming in from the Pentagon of like, take that down. That's not the image we're after. This shouldn't be an image of American conquest. So he then took it down, and then they got an Iraqi flag up there, which I think possibly also may have belonged to an American soldier. So this is an event that was kind of fascinatingly staged and very much filmed and then presented very much at the time as spontaneously a load of Iraqis pulled down this statue. And of course, that wasn't really the story at all. It was definitely, at the very least, an enterprise absolutely facilitated and made possible by the American military. There may have been a small number of Iraqis involved, but there really weren't very many, and they certainly wouldn't have been able to do it by themselves. So it was interesting in that it was almost, you know, a lot of the other events that I'm talking about in the book, for instance, kind of, you know, pulling down the protesters against Stalinism, pulling down Joseph Stalin's statue in Budapest in 1956, was absolutely a kind of spontaneous revolution, pulling down this hated symbol. But it was almost like the news media and these US troops were trying to fake one of those to see if that would work. And it's funny in that it kind of did and didn't. I mean, it didn't work in that it wasn't the end of the war, obviously, and it wasn't the fall of Saddam. As I say, Saddam was not captured for many more months. And as we know, the war in Iraq raged on and really is still kind of not in a good state today. In no way was that a conclusion to what was happening. But also it does seem to have had a kind of interesting aftermath in that, I mean, I was talking to a lady who was Kurdish the other day, and she said they now celebrate that day when the statue came down because they've decided that was an important event. So it's very interesting how these events get built over with new meanings by people and kind of come to have significance. So maybe at some level, the faking of it worked. It's a very, very interesting event.
You know, in the book, in Fallen Idols, you share a quote from a man who was involved in the taking down and then expressed regret years later. What was his story?
So this is the guy who turned up with the sledgehammer. the guy who was the, as far as we know, was the kind of Iraqi instigator of it. Certainly he's claimed to be. And he's called Kadim al-Jaburi, and he's, or that's what it, that's what he's kind of called in the reports. And I think al-Jaburi is a nickname, but he, he claims that he went along there with the sledgehammer, and the Americans helped, and he's got this whole story about how he pulled the statue, helped to pull the statue down and all of this. And then afterwards, he's given a number of interviews actually, where he said that he really regretted doing this because what happened to Iraq afterwards was so disastrous that he actually would like to put the statue back up, he said in one interview. So this is kind of fascinating that he's kind of come full circle. And this is a guy whose background really seems to have been, very negative with Saddam Hussein. There's a whole story about how he worked for one of Saddam's sons and kind of, he was a motorcycle engineer and sort of got terribly mistreated. So he had lots of reasons to dislike them. But it's interesting that I guess his opinions have changed, as opinions always change throughout history, because of the subsequent events. Not necessarily that he's a huge Saddam fan now, but that I think the disorder afterwards was so bad that some people felt that perhaps when it was more orderly, it was preferable. So but it's fascinating to see his own opinions clearly changing over the years too.
Yeah. I mean, this is one example of many where you've stitched together sources and stories. I get a sense from you that you have a methodology to being able to tell the story of a statue and just to appreciate, despite their centrality in our cultural spaces, the stories of statues are often very elusive. Were there particular stories or facts in this book that you sought to find and couldn't, or maybe even some breakthrough ones that took you a long time just to kind of nail down one detail?
It's funny, some of them were so full of surprises, and the one that springs to mind, because it was so much more kind of interesting than I was expecting, I guess, was the very last chapter in the book is about George Washington. So it comes full circle. We start, of course, with him reading out Declaration of Independence, and then George III's statue being pulled down, and end in Portland, Oregon last year with the statue of George Washington being pulled down. Now, I wanted to kind of do this to look at this kind of, to get this slightly circular sense of this structure and how history kind of comes around in these ways. But that statue turned out, and I kind of was under the impression when I heard that news story and looked at that statue, that was just, there's lots of statues around that are kind of not particularly fascinating or interesting. They're just, they're kind of often mass produced, they're often cheaply produced. And so I didn't really have any great expectations from that statue. And then I looked into it. Okay, so, my methodology would be, okay, so who's the sculptor? What's his story and all of that? It's usually him. Not always. But yeah, it turned out that this sculptor had in fact already made a statue of George Washington, which had already been pulled down by the time he made this one. So he had made this statue of George Washington for Mexico. And it had gone up in Mexico City, and then it had been pulled down in, I guess, God, I'm trying to remember the date of the Mexican Revolution, I guess around 1915 or something like this. So he'd already kind of been through the mill with one going up and coming down. And I kind of found this so fascinating. It was really hard to find info on that. In fact, one of the only places that I could really corroborate that story and really find some information was just going back to very, very old editions of the New York Times and finding out that, yes, indeed, here it is being reported. Okay, nobody's, there's people haven't looked at this. But of course, the reporting was so thin at the time, they weren't really describing like what was fully happening or who was doing it. It's just one line in a report that kind of says, and the statue was pulled down of this. And you're like, oh, but tell me more, who did it? Did they, how did they get it down? What was it like? And sometimes you find that it's very hard to kind of get all these details. And then other times the reasons you can't get the details are because they've been suppressed. So I mentioned before the Stalin statue in Budapest that was pulled down in 1956. That was part of the Hungarian rebellion, the first really major rebellion against Soviet power. And it was, very brutally crushed, that rebellion, by the Red Army of the Soviet Union, and kind of form of communism was restored, not quite as strict as the previous Stalinist regime, but nonetheless was restored. And one thing that happened is that everybody who was involved in pulling down that statue, which was a lot of people, were jailed, and it was impossible to talk about what had happened. And they were jailed for a very long time, and nobody could discuss. They were actually, so they used to have this little fun term in prison. They'd say, "What are you in for?" And if you said, "I'm a sculptor," that meant you were one of the people that had pulled down this Stalin statue. But because it couldn't really be talked about publicly until the fall of communism, so really much later, kind of 1989, decades after, we have lost, even though there were 100,000 people present when that happened, we have lost the details of the order of events in which that occurred. We've got a number of people who wrote about it who maybe fled the country or escaped or kind of wrote memoirs later, but they don't really match up terribly well. They contradict each other in quite significant ways. So clearly some people have misremembered some parts. So even though that was this huge event, nobody filmed it. People took some photos during, before and after, but you can't piece together the exact order of events that took place. And there's lots of people who claim to have been responsible for various bits of it, but were they? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, in your reporting and in your writing, you're dealing with what happened, what was said to have happened, and how statues have been another way of conveying history. Did you feel pulled to correct the historical record? Or did you feel like you were really trying to weave together fact and fiction, or all these multiple voices?
I definitely wanted to kind of bring multiple voices out. I think, it's essentially, I think my job as a historian really is to tell the stories and present the stories. And really it's the reader's job to make their mind up as to what they make of this and what they think. I mean, I will present information that I can, verify, or if I can't verify it, I'll say very clearly that I can't verify it and that we have these stories, but we're not sure which one is true, or something like this. But I wanted to be, I do have obviously my own feelings about it that I make pretty clear in the introduction and conclusion to this book, about how we can, how we should deal with our monuments and all of this. But I think so much, as I said at the beginning, so much of the discussion is so partisan that I kind of wanted to take it out of partisan politics and say, look, these questions really depend so much on where you're sitting and which statues are being attacked and who's doing it. So I didn't want to kind of tell people what to think. I wanted to give people information, and then it's really, people should have their own opinions. They can judge for themselves, and they can most certainly look into some of these stories more deeply, because I could have written a much longer book. There's much more to say about these, and so many more statues to talk about.
Yeah, well, speaking of multiple voices, I want to bring in some audience questions as well. In our run up to the close of this program, that's been so fascinating. Thank you, Alex. And just on that spirit, there's a question: are there any particular monument controversies that are happening right now that you find interesting? And maybe I'll take that and rephrase it. What are some of the chapters that you wish you could write, or that are on your mind? From the framework you provided from your book.
Oh, there's so many. It keeps happening all the time. Well, even this week I've been thinking about, because, well, in New York, since we're here at the public library, there's been this controversy over the Thomas Jefferson statue at City Hall, which I think they have voted to remove, but there's a controversy over what happens to it next. It's going to not be in the chamber any longer, the kind of council chamber, but there's a question of where it goes to, which I believe is not yet entirely settled. But I think it's fascinating to see kind of these discussions happening. And of course, Jefferson is somebody who, it's so tricky around the founding fathers, obviously, because a lot of Americans really do hold those stories quite dear and hold those figures quite dear. But at the same time, somebody like Jefferson has been controversial literally since he was alive for his attitudes on slavery. This is not a new conversation, and and it's very interesting as a historian to see these conversations come up again, and new generations learn about them and fight them out and kind of debate them and discuss them. And I mean, from a historian's point of view, I'm really happy to see debate and discussion happening. This is excellent. Whatever the outcome, it's great that people are talking about history. So I do think, Jefferson in the book has merited he's got a little section of the Washington chapter, but I think, now, volume 2, he would just have to come in, he would have to be there. Also, finally, so after we designed this cover with Robert E. Lee just sort of springing off, this turned out to come true. That of course Richmond, Virginia, taken down. Now, I wrote in the book, I concentrated on the statue in New Orleans that came down in 2017, but this has now, of course, come down in Virginia as well. So that's an extraordinary moment. And yeah, they're continuing. So, I mean, these discussions are so much continuing around the world. They've now just announced another chapter in the book on Leopold II of the Belgians. Brussels is now having a working group to discuss, in their words, how they can decolonize public space, which is an extraordinarily progressive attitude in Belgium. Very unusual, very interesting. So it's all still changing. It's all to play for. So I'm sure it will keep going, because every generation does challenge historical memory. This is good and healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about a incredibly moving statue, not outside, but in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Smithsonian in America, where Thomas Jefferson is featured with a statue and bricks behind him. Several hundred of them are stacked, inscribed with the names of Black people that he and his family enslaved, and that this fuller story is presented in that space. I want to go to another question. And I was also thinking, it's a great question because it has to do with the story in part that you shared about George Washington, who was, according to your book and the accounts that you bring in, incredibly unpopular at the time of the close of his presidency and the kind of ups and downs. So this is a question from the audience, as I was struck by how many people were very much discredited during or after their lives, thinking of the Duke of Cumberland, King Leopold, George Washington, and they've been somehow later brought back and merited having a statue. And the question for you, Alex, is do you think those statues were intended to rehabilitate them? Or is there some point at which a statue has little to do with the person themselves?
I think often the statue has little to do with the person themselves. I think the statue has a lot to do with whatever current political agenda is going on when it goes up. I mean, and you certainly see it if we, Leopold, for instance, so King Leopold really did kind of die in disgrace for his personal administration of the Congo Free State, which was a horrible, brutal disaster, not to mince words on that one. And his later rehabilitation was an extremely kind of deliberate policy from the Belgian monarchy after the First World War, when, of course, a lot of European monarchies did not survive the First World War, and the Belgian monarchy did, and was very concerned to really kind of, re-entrench itself, to bring its image back to life, to be very positive. So they really tried to reclaim Leopold, and it did work for a while. And I think sort of similarly with Washington, something that fascinated me is how Washington has kind of, become this sort of absolute icon and, disconnected really from the things that may or may not have happened in his life. And that's not actually to undermine him whatsoever. He's a fascinating man, very, very much worthy of study, of course. And I mean, no question about that. But it's interesting to me that how much, even he can be made to serve an agenda. And I think in some ways the high point isn't even so much a statue, although there are many, but that extraordinary painting in the rotunda of the Capitol building, the apotheosis of Washington. Now, the word apotheosis literally means becoming a god. So this is an extraordinary way to portray a human being. But Washington himself, one cannot imagine that he would have wanted that. I mean, this is a man who refused to become king, and then they're showing him becoming a god. It's quite fascinatingly different from what his perspective might have been. And really what, that is about creating a kind of, I think you can see that the Washington worship really ramped up in the late 19th century, after the Civil War, when people were trying to use the Founding Fathers to kind of rebuild an American identity that kind of predated all that controversy and that they felt that everybody could unite behind. So I think that's what's going on there. And as I say, I don't think Washington himself remotely wanted to become a god. I think that would be completely outside anything he ever said or did.
Thank you for that. Another question is, of the statues that do not get pulled down, why do they stay standing? Are there discernible unifying characteristics?
No, I don't think there are. I think they do vary, but I suppose, you do, I mean, people want to take statues down generally. And again, this comes down to how, in the previous question, the statue may have little to do with the person themselves. It may have a lot to do with the regime that put them up. So what we see is that, you know, often people react against statues, not because they're necessarily critiquing the person themselves, but because they are critiquing that regime. And I think that's really notable right now with, you know, a lot of sort of Confederate statues and slaveholders and so on, is that actually this is a kind of howl of protest against a society that has refused to recognize these parts of history and really talk about them, and has actually celebrated them. That's, you know, that's what the protest is kind of very much against. So I think the ones that you see that stay up, I mean, it would be really hard globally to generalize, because actually it's really varied in different places. But I think often they are ones that feel to people like they are somewhat outside politics, that they, either because they are very beautiful, which is sometimes the case, or because they actually represent something that isn't particularly linked to contemporary politics, that it's a monument to something else. So I would say that, you know, there's certain statues. What's popular at the moment, for instance, is statues of non-political celebrities is certainly something that's started to go up. For instance, in Liverpool in the UK, there's really rather good statue of the Beatles that went up quite recently, the four of them on the docks, and they're just life-size, standing on the ground, walking along. So it's quite fun. You can go and interact with them and, you know, put your arm around them. And basically nobody hates that, because, you know, the Beatles are not politically controversial. They're not kind of a contested space particularly. Maybe a few Rolling Stones fans might object, but really pretty much nobody else. So, you know, those are kind of, I don't see any reason why that would come down. I imagine it will stay up because people like it. And you similarly see statues of animals, very, very popular. They often stay up and are popular because nobody objects to them. So I think it's when statues are up for, you know, it tends to be a kind of, they're beautiful or charming in some way. People like them, very, very simply. And they don't upset people. And those are the ones I think that really often kind of endure. And I also want to say a word for monuments for kind of general ideas of progress. So, I mean, you know, again, since we're talking about New York, the Statue of Liberty, which, you know, actually politically could be controversial in a number of ways, but which represents something positive, you know, the idea of liberty and freedom, rather than kind of memorializing. I mean, you talk about this actually in the National Monuments Audit, is rather than representing war and conquest, it's kind of trying to represent liberty. Now, of course, we may have some views on that these days in terms of how America was formed and so forth, but the ideal of the statue itself, at least, could feel like feels to a lot of people like it's beyond that. Similarly, monuments like the Eiffel Tower in Paris, supposed to represent science and technological progress, is kind of seen as something more positive. Again, you could probably say there's a negative side to that, but it doesn't stir up the same emotions as a statue with a very political figure attached to it.
Great. Well, on that note, Alex von Tunzelmann, it's been such a treat to be in conversation with you. The book is Fallen Idols, 12 Statues That Made History. We highly recommend it. This has been a really thoughtful conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, for your thoughts, and really looking forward to continuing, and who knows, maybe even seeing a next volume as the story pushes forward and continues.
Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you to everyone at New York Public Library and everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining us. For more information and to register for upcoming programs, visit nypl.org/live.